Welcome to the Page of Crime. On this episode, we are going to go over the life of a notorious serial killer who goes by the name Dennis Nilsen. But before we do that, I would like to start off by giving a big thanks to all my subscribers and those leaving comments and sharing the videos. You guys are greatly appreciated. With that being said, let's get into the video. This is a story not for the faint of heart, but for those who seek to understand the intricate and often disturbing facets of the human psyche. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born in the harsh winter of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His parents, Elizabeth Duthie White and Olav Magnus Moksheim, a Norwegian soldier who later adopted the surname Nilsen. Olav travelled to Scotland in 1940 as part of the Free Norwegian Forces following the German occupation of Norway. They would get into a relationship and married in 1942. During this time they would have 3 children. It was a troubled relationship from the start. Their marriage was a product of rushed decisions and wartime pressures leading to the father being absent most of the time, and by 1948, just a few years after Dennis's birth, they divorced. Dennis, his brother Olav Jr. and sister Sylvia, along with their mother, would live with her parents. His grandparents, Andrew and Lily White, née Duthie, were the pillars of support for the family, especially for Dennis, who adored his grandfather. Dennis was a quiet child, yet adventurous in his own ways. He harbored a deep love for animals, a fondness that would follow him throughout his life. He kept pigeons and was shattered when a vandal heartlessly killed them. Frequent family picnics in the Scottish countryside with his mother, siblings, and beloved grandparents were the highlights of his young life. His bond with his grandfather was particularly profound. The duo would embark on long walks along the harbour towards nearby Inverality, across the wide stretch of beach, up to the sand dunes, with Dennis often perched on his grandfather's shoulders. These walks were a cherished ritual that Dennis deeply adored. The absence of his seafaring grandfather, however, would cast a pall over Dennis, leaving him feeling lost and empty. But the pivotal moment in young Dennis's life came in 1951, on the 31st of October, when his beloved grandfather died at the age of 62 of a heart attack whilst fishing in the North Sea. This profound loss left a young Dennis, only 6 years old, devastated. His grandfather would be returned home before the burial. Here Nilsen's mother would ask him if he wanted to see his grandfather, in which he replied yes. She would then walk a young Dennis Nilsen over to where his grandfather rested. His mother's words, that his grandfather had gone to a better place and was merely sleeping. In the wake of his grandfather's death, Dennis became more withdrawn. He would stand alone at the harbour, watching the herring boats. At home, he distanced himself from family activities and began to resent the attention his mother and grandmother showered on his siblings. He retreated from any attempts of affection towards him. His only solace was his younger sister Sylvia, with whom he shared a close bond. She was his confidant, the only family member he felt close to after his grandfather's passing. Nilsen's life was marked by a dramatic incident in 1954 when he was just a child. At Inverality Beach, he found himself submerged underwater, almost being swept away by the sea. His panic was tangible as he gasped for air that wasn't there. Another youth would notice Nilsen in panic and be the one to save his life. Shortly after this close brush with death, Nilsen's life underwent another significant change. His mother moved out of his grandparents' house, taking him and his siblings with her. She married a builder named Adam Scott, and they had 4 more children. Nilsen's initial resentment for his stepfather gradually morphed into respect. The family relocated to the village of Streishan in 1955. It was here that Nilsen wrestled with a realization that would greatly impact his life. He discovered that he was homosexual, a revelation that confused and shamed him. He kept his sexuality hidden from his family and his few friends. Because many of the boys to whom he was attracted had facial features similar to those of his younger sister Sylvia, in an attempt to understand his feelings, he even fondled his younger sister Sylvia, hoping that his attraction towards boys was a manifestation of his affection for her. This confusion about his sexuality continued as he grew older. He kept his feelings hidden, even as he was attracted to some of his peers. He even fondled his older brother Olav Jr. in his sleep, leading his brother to suspect his homosexuality and teased him publicly. He would call Nilsen hen, Scottish slang for girl. Nilsen began to wonder if he was bisexual. He believed he was because of the attraction he had for his sister. As he grew into adolescence, Nilsen found life in Striken stifling. He felt trapped by the limited prospects and the poverty of his family. He respected his parents for their efforts to provide for their children, but resented their lack of ambition, making no effort to better their lifestyles. Seeking a change, at the age of 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force. School was all right for Dennis, ending with good results and a reputation for being athletic. After finishing school in 1961, he briefly worked in a canning factory before deciding to join the army and train as a chef. He passed the entrance exams and enlisted for a 9-year service in September 1961. Nilsen began his training with the Army Catering Corps at St. Omer Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire. He thrived in this environment, later describing his 3 years of training as the happiest of my life. He cherished the opportunities to travel and cherished the discipline and order of his duties. But even in this new environment, Nilsen's struggles with his sexuality continued. He kept his feelings hidden, even going so far as to avoid showering with his fellow soldiers for fear of revealing his attraction to them. His solitary baths provided him with the privacy he needed to contend with his feelings. In mid-1964, Nilsen was a young private serving with the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany, where he was assigned after passing his catering exam. It was during this period that Nilsen began to drink heavily, often to the point of excess, a habit he developed in an attempt to manage his shyness. A particular incident occurred while Nilsen was stationed in Germany. After a night of heavy drinking with a local German youth, he woke up in the young man's flat. No sexual activity had taken place, but the incident sparked a series of dark fantasies in Nilsen's mind. He began to imagine a sexual partner who was completely passive, a fantasy that evolved into a desire for the partner to be unconscious or even dead. Nilsen's fantasies took a more active form as he made attempts to have his own body sexually interfered with by his colleagues. He would pretend to be highly intoxicated, hoping that one of his colleagues would take advantage of his seemingly unconscious state. Yet, none of his attempts bore fruit. After 2 years in Osnabrück, Nilsen returned to Aldershot, where he successfully passed his official catering exam before being deployed to serve as a cook for the British Army in Norway. In 1967, Nilsen was sent to the state of Aden, formerly Aden Colony, now part of Yemen. He would serve as a cook at Al-Mansoura prison. His time in Aden was more dangerous than his previous postings. His regiment would lose several men, caught in ambushes en route to the army barracks. Nilsen was also kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver who beat him unconscious and locked him in the boot of his car. In a fight for survival, Nilsen managed to turn the tables, beating the taxi driver unconscious with a jack handle and locking him in the trunk of his own taxi. While stationed in Aden, Nilsen had a room of his own, providing him with the privacy to indulge in his fantasies. He created scenarios in his mind where he was both the dominant and passive partner, often incorporating his near-death experience with the Arab taxi driver and the dead bodies he had seen in Aden. Nilsen would fantasize about a slender, attractive young blonde soldier who had been recently killed in battle and then dominated by a faceless, dirty, grey-haired old man who washed this body before engaging in intercourse with the corpse. Nilsen compensated by imagining sexual encounters with an unconscious body as he masturbated while looking at his own prone, nude body in a mirror. These fantasies were further fueled by a 19th-century oil painting titled The Raft of the Medusa. The painting portrays an old man holding the limp, nude body of a dead youth, an image that deeply resonated with Nilsen's morbid fantasies. Soon after, he would complete his deployment in Aden. Upon his return to the UK, he was assigned to serve with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders at Seaton Barracks in Plymouth, Devon. Here, he was charged with the responsibility of cooking for 30 soldiers and 2 officers on a daily basis. His life, it seemed, had settled into a well-defined routine. Nilsen served at these barracks for 1 year before being transferred with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders to Cyprus in 1969. His fellow recruit, Eric Talbot, recalls Nilsen as a quiet individual, bit sheepish, who kept himself to himself. he was not one to mingle with others or participate in sports. He would go out on a Friday or Saturday night, often seen wearing dark shirts and trousers, topped with a strange headmaster-like black cape. Some saw him as strange, but Nilsen was also deeply religious, attending church regularly and participating in extra prayers. The regiment was soon transferred to West Berlin. It was around this time that Nilsen began to discover his true self. His first sexual encounter with a woman, a prostitute. He bragged of this sexual encounter to his colleagues, but in reality he found intercourse with a female both overrated and depressing. It left him feeling empty. He concluded that he was homosexual. Later, he was selected to cook for the Queen's Royal Guard, an honor that was soon followed by a reassignment to a different regiment in the Shetland Islands. Here, he fell in love with an 18-year-old private, a feeling he kept to himself and a love that was not returned. Soon after, the young man would be transferred. A heartbroken Nilsen burned hundreds of movie films that the pair had made together, a move that left his colleagues bewildered. In October 1972, Nilsen ended his 11-year military career at the rank of corporal. His departure was fueled by political differences over matters related to Northern Ireland, most notably Bloody Sunday. Back in Scotland, he would move back home with his mother and siblings in Strichen. Nilsen found himself at odds with his family, especially his mother, who was concerned about his lack of interest in women. A documentary on male homosexuality led to a heated argument with his brother, who subsequently revealed Nilsen's homosexuality to their mother. This disclosure led to a rift between the brothers. In a bid to recapture the way he had felt within the army, Nilsen moved to London in December and joined a training course for the Metropolitan Police. He would be assigned the police number Q287. In April 1973, Nilsen's police training was complete. He would be posted to Willesden Green. He found himself drawn to the macabre world of the morgue. Autopsied bodies held a dark fascination for him, a fascination that would only grow with time. Despite the grim allure of his work, Nilsen left the force. Loneliness became his companion, often drowning his solitude in drink. Throughout the summer of '73 and into autumn, Nilsen found himself frequenting gay pubs throughout the city, places like King William IV, the Cologne, the Golden Lion, and the Black Cap, and the Cricklewood Arms. It was during this time that Nilsen began engaging in casual encounters with men, searching for companionship. However, these relationships would always end in disappointment. Around this same time, Nilsen had his first brush with the law. A young man named David Painter, whom Nilsen had met through work, accused Nilsen of photographing him while he slept. The confrontation that followed landed Painter in the hospital and Nilsen in police custody, as he was brought in for questioning. However, the police released Nilsen without any charges. In August, his father died in Ghana. Leaving behind a small fortune for his children, Nilsen found himself with an extra £1,000, equivalent to about $10,600 in today's money. In December, Nilsen resigned from the police force. He believed his personal lifestyle could no longer coexist with his profession. In the following months, Nilsen found work as a security guard. The inconsistent nature of the work led him to seek out more stable employment. By May of 1974, Nilsen found himself working for the Manpower Services Commission in a job centre in Denmark Street, helping unskilled labourers find work. His co-workers knew him as a quiet, diligent employee, active in the trade union movement. Despite a mediocre attendance record, Nilsen often volunteered for overtime, leading many to believe he preferred his own company. Then, in November 1975, a chance encounter with a man named David Gallichan would change Nilsen's life. After intervening in a scuffle outside a pub, Nilsen invited Gallichan to his home at 80 Teignmouth Road in the Cricklewood district of North London. The two spent the evening drinking and talking, finding a common bond. Gallichan, a recent arrival in London from Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, was gay, unemployed, and living in a hostel. By morning, the two had decided to find a larger residence where they could live together. Using the inheritance from his father, Nilsen began searching for a property to rent. They soon found a ground-floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. Upon moving in, they found the flat to be largely unfurnished, though it was meant to be furnished. Nilsen negotiated a deal with the landlord, whereby he and Galichan had exclusive use of the garden at the rear of the property. Over the following months, the couple transformed the space into their own and brought a dog and called him Bleep. Galichan took charge of the redecoration. Nilsen saw himself as the breadwinner, the primary force in their relationship. Although Nilsen was attracted to Galichan, the pair rarely had intercourse. Galichan would deny they had a homosexual relationship. Their domestic bliss was short-lived. Within a year of moving in, the superficial relationship began to crumble. They slept separately, brought home casual partners, and arguments became a frequent disturbance in their lives. By May 1977, following a heated argument, Galichan decided to leave. With Galichan gone, Nilsen formed brief relationships with several young men over the following 18 months. None of these relationships lasted. By late 1978, Nilsen was living in solitude. He was convinced he was unfit to live with. He turned to his work, which he devoted an ever-increasing amount of his time, and alcohol to hide his grief. Then, on the 29th of December, 1978, Nilsen's life took a sinister turn. His first victim was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. Nilsen, who had been drinking heavily at home alone and listening to music, told himself he must go out to find some company. Holmes had encountered Nilsen in the Cricklewood Arms pub, when Holmes had unsuccessfully tried to purchase alcohol. Nilsen invited Holmes back to his house with the promise of drinks and music. The next morning, on the 30th of December, after a night of heavy drinking, Nilsen awoke to find Holmes sleeping beside him. But instead of waking him, Nilsen decided Holmes would stay with him over the new year, whether he wanted to or not. He would stare at him for a bit and touch on his body. Dennis Nilsen then went and got a necktie that was nearby, and he strangled Holmes into unconsciousness, then drowned him in a bucket of water. Nilsen then washed the body before placing it on his bed and caressing it. He would have his way with the unalived body. When he was finished, Holmes's corpse remained hidden beneath the floorboards for almost 8 months before Nilsen burned it in a bonfire he built in his garden on the 11th of August 1979. On the 11th of October, Nilsen attempted to kill again. This time, his intended victim was a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho. They had met at St. Martin's Lane pub, and here, Nilsen lured Ho to his flat on the promise of sex. Ho managed to escape after a bondage play session, where Nilsen attempted to strangle him and reported the incident to the police. Nilsen was questioned, but Ho decided not to press charges. On a cold day on the 3rd of December the same year, Nilsen crossed paths with Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian student who came to see family and was touring England. Their encounter was seemingly innocent, a chance meeting at a West End pub. But as the night unfolded, and learning of Ockenden's tourist status, he offered to show him the sights of London. An offer that the young man readily accepted. As the evening wore on, Nilsen extended an invitation to his home for a meal and more drinks, an invitation that would seal Ockenden's fate. Stopping at an off-license en route to Nilsen's residence, they purchased whiskey, rum, and beer. Back at Nilsen's, the pair continued to drink and listen to music, and then, in a chilling turn of events, Nilsen would grab a pair of his headphones and would come up from behind Ockenden and strangled Ockenden with the cord of his headphones. In the aftermath, Nilsen dragged Ockenden's lifeless body across the floor, the wire still wrapped around his neck. He then poured himself a glass of rum and continued his evening as if nothing had happened, listening to music on the very headphones he'd used to kill Ockenden. The following day, Nilsen proceeded to photograph Ockenden's body in various positions with a newly purchased Polaroid camera. He watched television for several hours with Ockenden's corpse sprawled above him on his bed before finally wrapping him up in plastic bags and concealing the body beneath his floorboards. Over the next 2 weeks, Nilsen would pull up Ockenden's body from the floorboards on multiple occasions, seating the corpse beside him as he watched television and drank. Amidst this horrifying series of events, Nilsen received a promotion at his job center role to executive officer. On the 17th of May 1980, Nilsen claimed his third victim, a 16-year-old catering student named Martin Duffy from Birkenhead, Merseyside, who had hitchhiked to London without his parents' knowledge on the 13th of May after being questioned by the British Transport Police for evading his train fare. After 4 days of sleeping rough near Euston railway station, Nilsen encountered the youth as he returned from a union conference in Southport. They spoke for a bit, and then Duffy gratefully accepted Nilsen's offer of a meal and a bed. But once asleep, Nilsen grabbed a cord sat on Duffy's chest, with his legs over his arms, and strangled Duffy until he was unconscious. He then dragged the young man with the cord around his neck to the kitchen and drowned him in his kitchen sink. He then bathed the body. Duffy's body was placed on a kitchen chair, then on the bed on which he had been strangled. The body was repeatedly kissed, complimented, and caressed by Nilsen. He had masturbated while sitting upon the stomach of the corpse. For 2 days, Duffy's body was stowed in a cupboard, before Nilsen noted signs of bloating. Therefore, he went straight under the floorboards. Nilsen's next victim, a 26-year-old father named William David Sutherland from Edinburgh, who worked as a male prostitute, he was killed on the 20th of August the same year. During a night out at a pub near Piccadilly Circus, Sutherland met Nilsen. After some drinks and a conversation, they would decide to go back to Nilsen's place. As usual, they would continue to drink and listen to music. Sutherland was then strangled at some point in the early hours of the morning. An unidentified tall Irish labourer with rough hands that wore an old suit, jacket and shoes was the 5th victim of Dennis Nilsen. Nilsen encountered him in September at the Cricklewood Arms. His height was between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches, and he was estimated to be between 27 and 30 years old. He was also strangled. Just a month later, in October, Nilsen would cross paths with another unidentified man, his 6th victim. A slender male prostitute, he stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and was between 20 and 30 years old. His descent was unclear, possibly Filipino or Mexican. Their meeting place was the Salisbury Arms. In November, Nilsen found another victim, an Englishman in his 20s, with a pale complexion and several missing teeth, who was homeless. He was discovered sleeping in a doorway at the top of Charing Cross Road. He and Nilsen would end up taking a taxi back to Melrose Avenue, where he was strangled to death as he slept. Nilsen chillingly remarked that taking this man's life was as easy as taking candy from a baby. Another victim fell prey to Nilsen in November or December, an English long-haired man aged between 25 and 30. They met in the West End after the pubs had closed. The victim's body was retained beneath the floorboards of the flat until Nilsen dissected it into 3 pieces and replaced the remains beneath the floorboards. As time passed, the bodies beneath Nilsen's floorboards started to attract insects and emit a foul odour, especially during the summer. On occasions when Nilsen pulled victims from beneath the floorboards, the bodies were covered with pupae and infested with maggots. Some victims' heads had maggots crawling out of eye sockets and mouths. Even as he tried to mask the smell with deodorants and insecticides, the stench of decay persisted and flies became more present at the home. In late 1980, Nilsen removed and dissected the bodies of each victim killed since December 1979, burning them on a communal bonfire behind his flat. To mask the smell of burning flesh, he topped the bonfire with an old car tire. 3 neighbourhood children stood to watch this bonfire. When the bonfire had been reduced to ashes, Nilsen used a rake to search the debris for any recognisable bones. Noting a skull was still intact, he smashed it to pieces with his rake. In the early days of January 1981, Nilsen encountered another unidentified man, an 18-year-old blue-eyed young Scot at the Golden Lion pub in Soho. Nilsen then suggested they should go back to his at Melrose Avenue for a drinking contest. After several drinks, Nilsen strangled him with a tie and placed his body beneath the floorboards. He even took a sick day from work on the 12th of January to dissect this victim and another he had killed a month earlier. In February 1981, an unidentified man from Belfast in his early 20s became Nilsen's next victim. The young man, slim with dark hair, around 5 feet 9 inches, he was lured into Nilsen's world after a night out in London's West End. He would head back to Nilsen's only to be strangled with a necktie and hidden beneath the floorboards. As spring arrived in April 1981, Nilsen claimed his 11th victim at a food stall in Leicester Square. A muscular English skinhead, no older than 20, who bragged about his toughness and love for fighting. He wore a black leather jacket and a tattoo around his neck that chillingly read, "Cut here." Like many before him, he was drawn to Nilsen's home with the promise of food and alcohol. His torso hung in Nilsen's bedroom for a full day before joining the others beneath the floorboards. September brought Malcolm Barlow, a 23-year-old epileptic, into Nilsen's grim collection. He would be the final victim to be murdered at Melrose Avenue. Barlow, who Nilsen had found slumped outside his own home, actually did try to help Barlow, checking on him to see if he was all right, after finding out that he was on medication and his epilepsy caused his legs to weaken. Nilsen would help Barlow up and took him into his home. He then called the emergency service, explaining the situation. Soon after, an ambulance would arrive to take Barlow in for care. The following day, Barlow returned to Nilsen's home to thank him. He was invited in and, after a meal, began drinking rum and coke before falling asleep on the sofa. He was then strangled and stowed under the kitchen sink, with no room left under the floorboards. Nilsen's landlord decided to renovate the property at 195 Melrose Avenue in mid-1981 and asked Dennis Nilsen to leave the property. Nilsen was originally reluctant, but accepted an offer of £1,000 from the landlord to vacate the residence. Nilsen relocated to an attic flat at 23D Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill on the 5th of October 1981. Before leaving, he burned the bodies of his last 5 victims in a bonfire in his garden, masked by the smell of a burning tire. Nilsen had already dissected the bodies of 4 of these victims in January and August, and needed only to complete the dissection of Barlow for this bonfire. At 23 Cranley Gardens, Nilsen found himself without a garden or floorboards to hide his victims, as he was in an attic. For 2 months, those who came to his flat left unharmed. However, on the 23rd of November, a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobes narrowly escaped death. Dennis Nilsen attempted to strangle Nobes, but stopped himself from completing the act. Nobes woke up dazed with a red eye, later learning at the hospital that someone had tried to strangle him. But for some reason, he never reported Nilsen to the police. Toshimitsu Ozawa, a Japanese chef, also narrowly avoided becoming a victim. He grew uncomfortable and left when he felt Nilsen kept trying to creep up behind him. In March 1982, the unsuspecting John Howlett, a young man of just 23 years, crossed paths with Nilsen in a pub near Leicester Square. Originally from High Wycombe, Buckinghamshire, Howlett was charmed into accompanying Nilsen back to his flat under the pretense of a friendly evening of drinks and a film. As the night wore on, Howlett fell asleep in Nilsen's bed, only to be awoken by a deadly struggle. Nilsen, after an unsuccessful attempt to wake Howlett, found himself sitting on the edge of the bed, a glass of rum in hand, staring at Howlett, contemplating a sinister plan. The struggle that ensued was fierce, with Howlett fighting back in a desperate attempt to overpower his attacker. However, Nilsen eventually managed to strangle Howlett into unconsciousness using an upholstery strap. Shaken from the stress of the fight, he then attempted to kill Howlett 3 times over the next 10 minutes after noticing he was still breathing. Unable to complete his gruesome task, Nilsen resorted to filling his bathtub with water, intending to drown Howlett. Once his heinous act was done, Nilsen dismembered Howlett's body, disposing of the flesh and internal organs down the toilet, and leaving the larger bones out with the rubbish. For a week following this chilling act, the marks of Howlett's desperate struggle for survival were imprinted on Nilsen's own neck. Fast forward to May, and Nilsen found his next victim, Carl Stottor, a 21-year-old gay man nursing a broken heart at the Black Cap pub in Camden. After engaging Stottor in conversation and talking about his failed relationship, they would have multiple drinks. Nilsen invited him back to his flat, reassuring him that he had no intention of engaging in any sexual activities. At the flat, Stottor found himself being strangled by Nilsen. He fell asleep on a sleeping bag. Initially, he believed Nilsen was trying to help him out of the sleeping bag that he had become entangled in. Before he lost consciousness, Nilsen would be telling him to stay still. He awoke to the sound of running water, only to realize that he was being drowned. Despite his pleas for mercy, Nilsen simply submerged Stottor's head beneath the water once again. Believing that he had killed Stottor, he placed him in his armchair. Nilsen attempted to revive him when he noticed that he was still barely alive. He then placed him on his bed and covered him with a blanket. Over the next 2 days, Stotter would drift in and out of consciousness, with Nilsen explaining away the strangulation and immersion in cold water. He explained to Stotter he had almost strangled himself on the zip of the sleeping bag, and that he had rescued him and he had placed him in cold water because he was in shock. Once Stotter had regained enough strength, Nilsen escorted him to a nearby railway station, parting ways with a casual farewell, leaving Stotter with a chilling memory of a nightmare that was all too real. During June 1982, Nilsen was transferred to another job centre in Kentish Town. Nilsen encountered a 27-year-old named Graham Allen, who was trying to hail a taxi on Shaftesbury Avenue. Allen, unsuspecting, accepted Nilsen's offer for a meal at his home in Cranley Gardens. As Allen sat eating an omelette, Nilsen approached him from behind and strangled him. For 3 days, Allen's body was kept in the bathtub before Nilsen began the grim task of dissecting his body on the kitchen floor. On the 9th of October 1982, Nilsen informed his employers that he was ill and unable to attend work. This would be the day Nilsen would dissect the body of Graham Allen. Fast forward to the 26th of January 1983, when Nilsen claimed his final victim, a 20-year-old named Stephen Sinclair. Sinclair was last seen in Nilsen's company, walking towards a tube station. Back at Nilsen's flat, Sinclair fell into a drug and alcohol-induced sleep in an armchair as Nilsen listened to the rock opera, Tommy. As Sinclair slept, Nilsen approached him, knelt before him and whispered, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again," before strangling Sinclair with a ligature made from a necktie and a rope. Nilsen noticed crepe bandages on Sinclair's wrists, which concealed several deep slashes from a recent suicide attempt. Following his usual ritual, Nilsen bathed the body, laid it on his bed, and applied talcum powder. He arranged 3 mirrors around the bed before lying naked alongside the lifeless form. Hours later, he turned Stephen's head towards him, kissed his forehead and said, "Good night, Stephen." Nilsen then fell asleep next to the body. Sinclair's body, like those of Howlett and Allen before him, was subsequently dissected. The dismembered parts were wrapped in plastic bags and stored in a wardrobe, a tea chest, a drawer beneath the bathtub. The bags holding Sinclair's remains were sealed with the same crepe bandages Nilsen had found on Sinclair's wrists. In an attempt to dispose of the remains, Nilsen flushed the flesh, internal organs, and smaller bones of his victims down his toilet. He also boiled the heads, hands, and feet to remove the flesh, a practice he had conducted on several victims at Melrose Avenue. Twice a day, he would spray the rooms to rid them of the flies that hatched from the decomposing bodies hidden within. When neighbors complained about the smell, he would convince them it was due to structural problems with the building. On the 4th of February, Nilsen wrote a letter to his estate agents and a fellow resident, complaining about the blocked drains at the property. The following day, he almost got caught doing the unthinkable when he refused entry to an acquaintance. His reason? He had begun to dismember another victim's body on his kitchen floor. Nilsen had been able to avoid detection for so long because of his choice of victims. He targeted vulnerable young men, often homeless or homosexual, societal outcasts with no fixed address. On the 8th of February, a Dino Rod employee, Michael Catron, responded to the plumbing complaints. Upon opening a drain cover, Catron discovered a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones. He reported his suspicions to his supervisor Gary Wheeler, explaining he found bones, but he couldn't tell what kind of bones, and due to the time it was starting to get dark, they agreed to postpone further investigations until the following morning. Before leaving, Catron discussed the blockage with Nilsen and another tenant, Jim Alcock. When Catron mentioned how the substance resembled human flesh, Nilsen casually dismissed it, saying, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." But as the prospect of his capture loomed throughout the night, he tried to remove the human tissue from the drains that night, only to be spotted by Jim Alcock, the other tenant. The next morning at 7:30, Catron and his supervisor Gary Wheeler returned to Cranley Gardens to find the drain mysteriously cleared. However, they discovered more scraps of flesh and bones in a pipe leading from the drain coming from the top flat, which they believed to be human. The police were called, and a pathologist confirmed their suspicions. These remains were taken to the mortuary at Hornsey, where pathologist David Bowen advised police that the remains were human, and that one particular piece of flesh had been a human neck that bore a ligature mark. When Nilsen returned home from work that day, he was greeted by Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and two colleagues who waited outside the house until Nilsen returned home from work. When Nilsen arrived, DCI J introduced himself and his colleagues, explaining they had come to inquire about the blockage in the drains from his flat. Nilsen asked why the police were interested in his drains, and also whether or not the two officers present with J were health inspectors. In response, J informed Nilsen that the other two were also police officers, and requested access to his flat to discuss the matter further. 3 officers followed Nilsen into his flat, where their senses were assaulted by the unmistakable odor of rotting flesh. When confronted about the human remains causing a blockage in his drains, Nilsen acted as if he was in shock, stating, "God grief, how awful." But the facade didn't last long. Upon further probing, DCIJ would say, "Don't mess about, where's the rest of the body?" He calmly admitted that more of the body could be found in 2 plastic bags in a nearby wardrobe, the stench of which confirmed his chilling confession. Nilsen was asked whether there were any other body parts to be found, to which Nilsen replied, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest, not here, at the police station." Nilsen was then arrested and cautioned on suspicion of murder before being taken to Hornsey police station. On the journey, he casually revealed that the remains in his flat belonged to not 1, not 2, but 15 or 16 victims, dating back to 1978. As the investigation deepened, the horror escalated. That evening, Detective Superintendent Chambers accompanied DCI Peter J. and Bowen to Cranley Gardens, where the plastic bags were removed from the wardrobe and taken to Hornsey mortuary. 1 plastic bag held 2 dissected torsos and a shopping bag of various internal organs. The second bag contained a human skull almost completely devoid of flesh, a severed head and a torso with arms attached, but hands missing. Both heads had been subjected to moist heat. On February 10th, Nilsen confessed to storing more human remains in a tea chest in his living room and an upturned drawer in his bathroom. The dismembered body parts belonged to 3 men, all of whom he had killed by strangulation. 1 victim he couldn't name, another he knew only as John the Guardsman, and the third he identified as Stephen Sinclair. Furthermore, he admitted to having killed 12 or 13 men at his former address and unsuccessfully attempted to kill approximately 7 others. Nilsen's house of horrors didn't end there. Further search revealed a lower section of a torso and 2 legs stowed in a bag in the bathroom, and a skull, a section of a torso, and various bones in the tea chest. Yet, despite the mounting evidence and his own confessions, Nilsen claimed not to understand his motives for the murders. On the 11th day of February, 1983, formal charges were brought against Nilsen for the murder of Stephen Sinclair, a young man of just 20 years. Professor Bowen confirmed the identity of the victim through fingerprints that matched police records. Meanwhile, Nilsen awaited his trial while on remand behind the cold, unforgiving bars of Brixton Prison. Over the subsequent days, police delved into the mind of Nilsen, conducting 16 interviews that spanned over 30 grueling hours. Nilsen remained resolute in his claim that the decision to kill was only made in the fleeting moments before the act. His counsel, Ronald Moss, was dismissed on the 21st of April, only to be recalled a few days later, the 26th of May, 1983. Nilsen stood before the Central Criminal Courts, charged with 5 counts of murder. However, by July, he expressed a desire to represent himself, dismissing Moss once more. An altercation with prison officers on the 1st of August resulted in Nilsen recalling Moss on the 5th of December. He would be found guilty of assault. His punishment: 56 days of solitary confinement. During this time, he again dismissed his legal aid only to hire Ralph Haems, the lawyer of a fellow inmate, David Martin, with whom Nilsen was in love with. On the 24th of October, 1983. Nilsen's trial began at the Old Bailey, presided over by Mr. Justice Croom Johnson. The charges against Nilsen had evolved to 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder, to all of which Nilsen pled not guilty. Alan Green, the prosecutor, argued that Nilsen was sane, his crimes premeditated. Survivors Paul Nobbs, Douglas Stewart, and Carl Stotter gave their testimonies, while physical evidence, including photographs of the murder scenes, was presented. Nilsen's defense, led by Ivan Lawrence, sought a verdict of manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility, citing Nilsen's mental abnormalities. A diagnosis of a borderline pseudo-normal narcissistic personality disorder was offered by psychiatrist Patrick Galway, suggesting Nilsen's actions were not born of malice aforethought. However, Paul Bowden, who had spent considerable time with Nilsen, argued that his abnormality was merely colloquial. According to Bowden, Nilsen was manipulative, capable of forming relationships, and chose to objectify people. During the summing up, the judge reminded the jury that a mind can be evil without being abnormal. The jury retired on the 3rd of November, 1983, but couldn't agree on a unanimous verdict. The next day, at 11:15 in the morning, the judge agreed to accept a majority verdict. At 4:25 in the afternoon, the jury delivered their decision. Guilty on all 6 counts of murder. Despite pleading not guilty on all charges by diminished responsibility, Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment on the 4th of November 1983, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years with no parole. He would then be sent to HMP Wormwood Scrubs. In December the same year, within the walls of Wormwood Scrubs, a confrontation erupted in the exercise yard. Dennis Nilsen crossed paths with Albert Moffat, a 21-year-old inmate. The encounter escalated, ending with Nilsen being slashed across the face with a razor, a deep wound requiring 89 stitches. Albert Moffat found himself standing before a judge, answering for his actions. He claimed Nilsen had made unwanted advances towards him. When Moffat rejected him, Nilsen allegedly lunged at him with a metallic object. "I wasn't going to stand there and let him start chopping me to pieces," Moffat told the jury. He insisted his actions were purely in self-defense. The jury at Knightsbridge Crown Court deliberated for 2.5 hours. The verdict? They concluded that Moffat had indeed attacked Nilsen in self-defense. Moffat's post-trial comments were chilling. "I have no remorse about what I did. I'm sorry it wasn't 189 stitches he got instead of 89 because the man is a monster." Moffat went on to assert that Nilsen was a coward, only capable of killing those who were drunk or drugged, and that he wouldn't hesitate to act again. Soon after this incident, Nilsen was moved to HMP Wakefield. In the year 1992, Nilsen made a startling claim. The true count of his victims, he alleged, was 12. He had fabricated the tale of 3 additional victims he initially confessed to having killed at Melrose Avenue, a ruse designed to throw off the investigation. DCIJ, however, dismissed this claim. He stated that in the more than 30 hours of interviews police had conducted with Nilsen, discussing the 15 victims he initially confessed to killing, Nilsen had never provided any inconsistencies in the physical characteristics, the date or place of encounter, the act of murder, or the ritual he observed with the body of any of the 15 victims. In 1993, Nilsen was moved to HMP Albany. In December 1994, a significant change occurred. Home Secretary Michael Howard declared that Nilsen should never be released from prison, and his sentence was altered to a whole-life tariff. In 2003, Nilsen would be transferred to HMP Full Sutton in East Riding, Yorkshire, where he would remain. Among all the victims, Holmes was the only one not to have been dissected before disposal. Investigators announced his identification in November 2006. On the 10th of May, 2018, Nilsen, suffering from severe abdominal pains, was taken to the hospital. He was found hunched over in pain in his cell, but after his pulse and blood pressure were found within normal range, he voluntarily returned to his cell. Later that day, his condition worsened to the point where an ambulance had to be called. Paramedics discovered Nilsen had a pulsing abdominal mass, later identified as a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm and a dangerously high aspiration rate. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, Nilsen died at York Hospital, 34 years into his life sentence. Unable to cope with the blood loss and the long surgery, his life came to an end. The official cause of death was given as a pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage linked to the ruptured aneurysm. A report from the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman stated that Nilsen had been left deteriorating for 2.5 hours after rejecting the opportunity to be seen for longer in the healthcare wing on the morning of the 10th of May. However, the report also stated that the treatment he initially received in prison was commensurate with that which he would have received in the community. Recording his verdict, Hull coroner Prof. Paul Marks stated, "Dennis Andrew Nilsen died of natural causes." Nilsen was cremated in June 2018. No family members were present, even though his ashes were later handed to his family. Some of Nilsen's victims were never identified, and it's believed he killed more, especially after releasing audio tapes of his crimes. And so, this chapter of Nilsen's life comes to a close. A period defined by a growing fascination with death, a struggle for companionship, and a search for stability. Reflecting on these events, one can't help but ponder the nature of evil and the ability of people to hide their true selves. A chilling reminder that monsters often hide in plain sight. A chilling end to a horrifying tale of a man who hid behind the facade of an ordinary neighbor while harboring deadly secrets within the walls of his flat. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe, also like, comment, and subscribe.